In the endless silence of the Gobi Desert, under a sky dense with stars, a caravan moves like a speck through time. But this is not just a trek across sand. It's the first step of a 17-year-old Venetian merchant into a world of unimaginable splendor, whispered legends, and terrifying beauty. Trace the path of Marco Polo, not through dusty history, but through the scent of strange spices, the feel of desert wind on skin, and the awe of standing before the greatest empire on earth. This is the journey that redefined the world and the young man who carried its secrets home. The Gobi Desert stretches endlessly under a blanket of stars, so silent you can hear the universe breathe. It was across such emptiness that a young Venetian merchant once traveled, his caravan a tiny speck, moving through a sea of sand and time. This isn't just the story of Marco Polo the legend, but of Marco Polo the young man, 17 years old, standing at the threshold of a world beyond imagination. We'll trace his path not through dates and battles, but through the scent of strange spices, the feel of desert wind, the awe of towering mountains, and the quiet reflections of a traveler forever changed by what he saw. This is a journey to get lost in, a story to fall asleep to. Before the deserts, there was water. The gentle lapping of canal waves against weathered stone steps was the constant soundtrack of Marco's youth. Venice, in the 13th century, was a city of whispers. Whispers of profit, of distant lands, and of the two men who were his father and uncle. Niccolo and Maffeo Polo were merchants, and their trade had taken them east years before Marco could truly remember them. Their long absence was a quiet space in his life, a mystery made of rare letters and second-hand stories. Then they returned. The water carried their ship home, and with them they brought more than exotic goods. They carried tales that sounded like fables of a Mongol emperor, Kublai Khan, who ruled an empire of staggering size and sophistication from a distant land called Cathay. They spoke of his curiosity about the Christian world, his tolerance, his immense power, and they revealed his request that they return to him with learned men and holy oil from Jerusalem. For Marco, now no longer a child, the decision was made. The family enterprise would embark on its greatest venture. The familiar, watery embrace of Venice would be exchanged for the unknown. The gentle sounds of home would be left behind for the silence of deserts and the cacophony of foreign tongues. He was going east. The voyage began not with the romance of the open sea, but with the practicalities of pilgrimage. Their first major stop was the Crusader port of Acre on the Levantine coast. Here, the air was thick with the scent of salt, incense, and the tension of a contested land. It was a place where the worlds of Europe and Asia first truly touched. A bustling, chaotic gateway. From Acre, they secured the holy oil requested by Kublai Khan, a small vial of profound significance that they would carry for thousands of miles. Then they turned north, sailing along the coast towards the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia and the port of Ayas. Ayas was a revelation. If Acre was a gateway, Ayas was the threshold itself. The harbour was a forest of masts, with ships from Genoa, Venice, and far beyond. The chatter in the streets was a symphony of languages: Armenian, Italian, Arabic, and the guttural tones of Mongol officials. Here, the Polos secured their most vital asset, a golden tablet, a paisa, given to them by a Mongol ambassador. This was not merely a passport, it was a key. Inscribed with the authority of the great Khan himself, it commanded all subjects of the empire to provide the bearers with horses, food, and safe passage. Holding its cool, heavy weight in his hand, Marco must have felt the immense power of the name it carried, a power that would open roads and command respect across a continent. The true nature of their journey now revealed itself. In Ayas, they left the sea behind. The gentle rocking of a ship was exchanged for the solid, unyielding presence of land. For Marco, a son of a city of boats, this was a profound shift. He felt the leather of a saddle for the first time, the sturdy bulk of a horse beneath him. The caravan assembled, a line of pack animals and guides stretching ahead into the dusty streets leading away from the coast. The comforting familiarity of the Mediterranean world faded with each clopping hoofbeat. They were turning their backs on the known world, and the sheer, silent weight of the unknown began to settle around them like a cloak. The road led them up and into the rugged highlands of Anatolia. The lush, green coastline quickly gave way to a harsher, more dramatic landscape. They climbed through mountain passes where the air grew thin and cool, following ancient paths worn smooth by countless travelers before them. The silence here was different from the desert silence to come. It was a mountainous quiet, broken only by the wind sighing through pine trees and the distant cry of an eagle. They passed Armenian monasteries perched impossibly on cliff faces, their stone walls seeming to grow from the rock itself. From within, the faint, haunting echo of chants would sometimes drift down, a sound of deep and ancient faith that felt both foreign and strangely familiar to the young Venetian. It was in these highlands that Marco experienced his first true immersion into a culture entirely separate from his own. They encountered bands of Turkoman nomads, their lives dictated by the seasons and the needs of their herds. The Polos were welcomed into their tents, low structures of felt and woven wool that offered shelter from the biting wind. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of mutton stew and smoke. There was a profound hospitality in these encounters, a code of conduct for the wilderness that ensured survival. Marco would have observed their customs, the way they drank fermented mare's milk, their skill with horses, the intricate patterns woven into their carpets. This was not the grand civilization he had been promised, but something perhaps more fundamental, a way of life in perfect harmony with a demanding land, a lesson in resilience that would serve him well on the long road ahead. The landscape itself was a teacher. They moved from fertile valleys, green with vineyards and orchards, to arid, sun-baked plateaus where the earth cracked underfoot. Each day brought new sights: fields of wild tulips, flocks of sheep tended by solitary shepherds, the ruins of forgotten castles standing sentinel over empty plains. The journey was slow, measured not in miles, but in the passing of sunrises and sunsets. For Marco, every sensation was new: the grit of dust on his skin, the taste of unfamiliar food, the constellations of the Anatolian night sky, arranged differently from those that shone over the Venetian lagoon. He was being stripped of his old self, layer by layer, and the first impressions of a vast and varied world were being etched into his memory. Descending from the Anatolian highlands, the world softened and opened up. The rugged mountains gave way to the immense, fertile plains of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The air grew heavy and warm, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming figs. They were following the ancient course of the Tigris River, its brown, sluggish waters a lifeblood for the cities and villages that clung to its banks. The rhythm of travel changed again. The cool nights became their allies, the caravan moving by moonlight to escape the punishing heat of the day. The stars reflected on the slow-moving water, a double canopy of light guiding them south. Their path eventually brought them to the shadow of a legend, Baghdad. But the city they found was a ghost of its former self. Just a few years before their arrival, the Mongol armies had swept through, leaving behind ruins and a palpable silence, where once there had been unparalleled grandeur. Marco would have seen the skeletal remains of palaces and mosques, the crumbled walls, the canals choked with debris. It was a sobering sight, a stark lesson in the transience of power. The stories of Baghdad's golden age, its house of wisdom, its bustling markets, were now just echoes among the rubble. For a young man raised on tales of Eastern splendor, this was his first encounter with its fragile underside, a reminder that empires, like caravans, are subject to the relentless flow of time. The journey along the Tigris was a slow, contemplative drift. The landscape was flat and endless, the horizon a shimmering line in the heat. They passed farmers tending to their date palm groves, fishermen casting nets from small boats, and the occasional fortified town, trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The further they traveled, the more the world felt ancient and layered. This was the cradle of civilization, and every stone seemed to hold a story. The heat was a constant companion, a physical pressure that dictated the pace of life. They learned to travel in the relative cool of the early morning and late evening, resting during the zenith of the sun, their bodies adapting to the rhythm of the land. It was here, in the quiet, heat-hazed afternoons, that Marco had ample time to reflect on the scale of the world and the long, long road that still lay ahead, leading them ever further from everything he had ever known. Leaving the fertile river valleys behind, the earth itself seemed to dry and crack under the sun. They entered the vastness of the Persian plateau, a world defined by the absence of water. The horizon stretched into a shimmering, heat-blurred infinity, broken only by the stark outlines of distant mountains. The air grew thin and carried the taste of dust, a fine powder that coated everything. Their clothes, their skin, the supplies in their packs. This was a landscape of absolutes, blinding white salt flats that burned under the noon sun, and immense seas of shifting sand dunes that whispered secrets with every gust of wind. The silence here was profound, a heavy blanket that made the sound of their own breathing seem loud. It was a place that demanded respect, where a mistake in navigation or a missed water source could mean a silent, sun-bleached end. Yet, within this austerity, there were miracles of life. The most beautiful of these were the caravanserais. After days of relentless exposure, the sight of one of these way stations on the horizon was a moment of pure relief. They were fortresses of hospitality, with high walls offering protection from both the elements and potential bandits. Passing through the great gate was like entering another world. The bustling courtyard was a symphony of sounds after the desert's silence. The braying of camels being unloaded, the chatter of merchants from a dozen different lands, the sizzle of food being prepared over open fires. The air was cool in the shaded arcades that lined the courtyard, a blessed respite from the furnace outside. Here, in these oases of human connection, the caravan could rest. They could drink cool water from deep wells, share stories with other travelers on equally improbable journeys, and sleep under a roof, safe beneath the vast, star-filled desert sky. One such oasis was the city of Kerman, a jewel set against the harsh backdrop of the desert. Renowned throughout the region, Kerman was a center for two very different treasures. The first was its turquoise, mined from nearby mountains, stones of the most exquisite blue-green, the color of a cool, distant lake that seemed to mock the surrounding aridity. Artisans cut and polished them, their workshops filled with the gentle whirring of grinding wheels. The second treasure was its falcons. The nobles of the East prized these magnificent birds of prey for the sport of falconry, and Kerman was famous for training the finest. Marco would have seen the falconers with their hooded birds perched on thick leather gloves, the creature's sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. It was a reminder that even in these harsh lands, human culture found ways to create and appreciate beauty and skill. But the beauty of the oases was always framed by the danger of the spaces between them. The fear of bandits was a constant low hum of anxiety that accompanied every step into the barren stretches. The empty landscape provided perfect ambush points, and stories of entire caravans disappearing were traded in hushed tones within the safety of the caravanserai walls. Their progress became a careful, vigilant dance. Scouts were sent ahead to check the route. The caravan master, a figure of immense experience and authority, decided the pace and the resting points. His knowledge of the hidden waterholes and safe passes, their only insurance. For Marco, this constant low-grade threat underscored the fragility of their mission. They were a tiny island of order and purpose, moving through a sea of emptiness and potential chaos. Their safety guaranteed only by a piece of gold from a king they had not yet met, and the hope that the next life-giving oasis would appear on the horizon before their supplies ran out. The desert's furnace heat gave way to a new kind of challenge, the bite of thin, cold air. They began the long, arduous ascent into the Pamir Mountains, a region so high and remote it was known as the roof of the world. The landscape transformed dramatically. The flat, dusty plains were replaced by jagged, snow-capped peaks that pierced the sky like stone teeth. The trails were narrow, often just a goat path clinging to the side of a precipice. The sound of the caravan changed. The soft crunch of sand was replaced by the clatter of hooves on loose scree, and the creak of saddles as the animals strained on the steep inclines. Breathing became an effort, a conscious drawing of air that never felt quite sufficient for the lungs. The world grew quiet, the wind whipping across the high passes with a lonely, mournful sound. It was in this majestic, unforgiving environment that Marco witnessed one of the most enduring images of his travels. He described seeing wild sheep of immense size, with horns so large that a man could scarcely carry a pair. These were the Ovis Poli, the Argali sheep that would later bear his name. To see these majestic creatures, perfectly adapted to this high-altitude realm, standing on an outcrop against an impossibly blue sky, was to witness a form of life that defied the harshness of its home. They moved with a quiet grace across the steep slopes, a symbol of resilience in the thin air and brutal cold. For Marco, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated wonder, a reminder that the world held wonders far beyond human kingdoms and commerce. The nights in the high Pamirs were an experience of profound isolation and breathtaking beauty. They would make camp in high-altitude valleys, sheltered from the worst of the wind. The cold was intense, seeping through layers of clothing. They huddled around fires that seemed feeble against the immense darkness, the flames flickering and casting long, dancing shadows on the faces of his companions. But when he looked up, the reward was a celestial spectacle unlike any he had ever seen. With the air so thin and clear, and far from any source of human light, the night sky was a dense, glittering tapestry. The Milky Way was not a faint smear, but a brilliant river of diamonds flowing from one horizon to the other. Lying there, wrapped in blankets, Listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the slow breathing of the animals, Marco was a tiny, insignificant speck beneath the cosmos. It was a humbling, almost spiritual experience, a silent conversation between a lone traveler and the infinite, high on the roof of the world. Descending from the cold, thin air of the Pamirs was like returning to the world of the living. The land began to slope downward, and the air grew warmer, carrying new scents on the wind, the smell of damp earth, of poplar trees, and of civilization. They arrived at the great oasis city of Kashgar, a legendary hub on the Silk Road. After the stark solitude of the mountains, the city was a shock to the senses. The markets were a riot of color and sound, vendors calling out in Yugur and Persian, the clang of coppersmiths, the sweet smell of melons and apricots piled high in wooden carts. Canals, fed by mountain streams, flowed through the city, their banks lined with willow trees whose leaves whispered in the breeze. Here, Marco saw the incredible diversity of the crossroads. Buddhist monks in saffron robes, Nestorian Christians with their distinctive crosses, Muslim merchants praying towards Mecca, and Mongol officials overseeing it all. Kashgar was not just a stop. It was a preview of the cultural tapestry that was Cathay itself, a vibrant, humming anticipation of the empire that lay ahead. But between Kashgar and the heart of that empire lay the greatest terrestrial challenge of their entire journey, the Taklamakan Desert. Its name, whispered with a mixture of fear and respect, translated to the place of no return. It was a sea of sand, but unlike the Persian deserts, this one was known for its shifting dunes that could swallow entire caravans, and its legendary sandstorms that could blot out the sun for days. The dread was a physical presence as they prepared on its western edge. The caravan was meticulously organized. Water was checked and rechecked, sloshing in heavy leather bags. Supplies were secured. The guides, their faces weathered by sun and wind, studied the horizon with a grim professionalism. Their progress into the Taklamakan was methodical and cautious, a silent, plodding march against an immense, silent foe. They traveled by night, navigating by the brilliant, clear stars that hung in the black velvet sky. The heat of the day was reserved for rest, huddled under makeshift shelters to escape the relentless sun. The silence was the most profound Marco had ever experienced, a deep, empty quiet broken only by the sound of the wind hissing over the dunes and the soft, rhythmic plod of the camels' feet in the sand. In this emptiness, the mind began to play tricks. He witnessed the strange phenomenon of desert mirages, shimmering lakes and inviting groves of trees that beckoned from the horizon, only to dissolve into nothingness as they drew near. At times, the desert itself seemed to sing, a low, humming vibration caused by the wind shifting the sands, a eerie music that spoke of the desert's ancient, indifferent power. Each day's travel was a small victory. Each surviving oasis, a cluster of hardy tamarisk trees around a brackish well, a cause for quiet celebration. They were a tiny, determined thread of life moving with immense patience across a vast, beautiful, and deadly emptiness. Leaving the hypnotic emptiness of the Taklamakan behind was like stepping from a dream back into the stream of history. The desert sands gradually gave way to a strip of relative fertility, a narrow corridor of life squeezed between the towering Tibetan plateau to the south and the vast, dry expanse of the Gobi Desert to the north. This was the Gansu Corridor, the final overland artery leading directly into the heart of Cathay. The air changed, carrying the scent of cultivated earth and flowering plants. Small villages appeared, their mud brick houses surrounded by fields of wheat and millet. The rhythm of life here felt ancient and settled, a stark contrast to the nomadic existence of the steppes and the transient nature of the desert caravans. It was here that Marco saw his first tangible proof of the empire they were approaching. Winding along the crest of the barren hills to the north was a long, serpentine line of tamped earth and stone. It was not the grand masonry wall of later centuries, but its purpose was unmistakable. This was the Great Wall, or at least its western reaches, a silent, imposing barrier that spoke of a civilization powerful enough to attempt to define its own boundaries against the wilderness. For Marco, it was a sight that must have stirred a complex mix of emotions, awe at the sheer ambition of the project, and a sobering realization of the scale and organization of the kingdom he was about to enter. This was not a land of isolated cities. This was a unified, defended realm. Their path took them past the oasis town of Dunhuang, a place of profound spiritual significance. Just outside the town, honeycombed into a cliff face, were the Mogao Caves, the caves of the 1,000 Buddhas. Even from a distance, the sight was mesmerizing. Hundreds of cave entrances, some small and humble, others grand and ornate, looked out over the desert. Inside, Marco would have seen a different kind of treasure, not gold or silk, but something quieter and more enduring. The walls of these caves were covered in intricate murals, paintings that told the stories of the Buddha's life in a brilliant cascade of color. Sculptures of serene deities sat in meditation, their painted eyes gazing into eternity. The air was cool and still, thick with the scent of old incense and plaster. In the quiet dimness, surrounded by the artistic devotion of centuries, the journey felt less like a commercial enterprise and more like a pilgrimage. The languages on the road began to shift more noticeably now. The familiar sounds of Persian and Turkic languages were gradually replaced by the sing-song tones of Chinese. The architecture changed, with gracefully curved tiled roofs replacing the flat rooftops of Central Asia. Every detail confirmed what they had long hoped. They were finally arriving. After years of travel through deserts and over mountains, the landscape softened into rolling green grasslands that seemed to stretch to the edge of the sky. This was the fabled Xanadu, the summer capital of the Great Khan, a place that would live in European poetry for centuries. The air was clean and cool, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp earth, a welcome relief after the dust of the long road. In the distance, the outlines of the Khan's palace and a city of white tents began to take shape against the horizon. For Marco, the sight was the culmination of everything. The hardship, the fear, the wonder. They were finally here. The imperial compound was a vision of ordered splendor. A marble palace stood at its heart, its halls spacious enough to host thousands, but it was the surrounding landscape that truly defined Xanadu. Meadows lush with grass were reserved for the Khan's vast herds of white horses. Streams meandered through the grounds, stocked with fish, and everywhere there was the quiet, purposeful activity of a mobile court. Soldiers in polished armor, officials in silken robes, servants preparing for a feast. The sheer scale of it was humbling. This was not just a king's residence. It was a portable city designed for both administration and pleasure, a testament to the Mongol ability to impose their will upon nature itself. The audience with Kublai Khan was a moment suspended in time. Led through courtyards and past guards, the Polos finally entered the great hall. The Khan sat elevated, a figure of immense presence surrounded by his family and highest advisors. The air was thick with silence, and the faint scent of sandalwood. Marco, alongside his father and uncle, performed the required prostrations. This was the moment of truth. They presented the sacred oil from Jerusalem and the letters from the Pope, physical proof of their long and perilous journey. They spoke of the Christian world, of Venice, of their loyalty. And then they waited under the gaze of the most powerful man on earth. Kublai Khan's reaction was not one of anger or suspicion, but of genuine curiosity and warmth. He welcomed them graciously, showing particular interest in the young Marco, whose sharp eyes and attentive demeanor did not go unnoticed. The tension of years dissolved in that moment, replaced by a profound sense of arrival. They had completed their mission. The golden Pisa had delivered them to its issuer, and they stood not as mere supplicants, but as honored guests in the court of the Emperor of the world. The long silence of the deserts was finally broken by the sound of acceptance, and a new chapter of their lives was about to begin under the vast open skies of Xanadu. The summer idyll of Xanadu was a seasonal retreat. The true heart of Kublai Khan's power lay several weeks' journey to the south, in the immense, planned capital of Dadu, the city that would later be known as Beijing. The approach to the city was a gradual unfolding of its scale. First came the outskirts, vast areas of gardens and orchards that supplied the imperial household. Then, the towering outer walls came into view, their sheer, imposing faces a declaration of permanence and strength. Passing through the massive gates was like entering a different world, a meticulously ordered universe of straight, wide boulevards that ran north-south and east-west, dividing the city into a perfect grid. The air hummed with a low, constant energy, the sound of 1 million people living and working under the singular will of the Khan. For Marco, a Venetian accustomed to the organic, watery chaos of his hometown, this geometric precision was astounding. It was a city built not by chance, but by design, a physical manifestation of the Mongol Empire's immense organizational power. At the very center of this ordered grid lay the heart of the heart, the imperial palace, known as the Forbidden City. Surrounded by high walls and a wide moat, it was a city within a city. Marco would have seen its golden glazed roof tiles glittering in the sun from a distance, a sight reserved for the privileged few granted entry. Inside, the grandeur was almost beyond description. The halls were vast, supported by columns of lacquered red wood, their walls covered in magnificent paintings of dragons and phoenixes. The floors were of polished marble. Gardens within the complex were designed as perfect miniature landscapes, with artificial lakes, carefully placed rocks, and rare flowering trees. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and profound silence, a stark contrast to the bustling metropolis that surrounded it. The air was scented with the delicate aroma of aloes wood and the faint floral note of the scholars' trees that bloomed in the courtyards. Beyond the palace walls, the city of Dadu was a study in organized chaos. The grid system gave it order, but the streets themselves were rivers of humanity. Marco walked through markets that seemed to stretch for miles, each district specializing in a particular trade. One entire street would be dedicated to the silversmiths, the air filled with the gentle tapping of small hammers. Another would be for the silk merchants, their shops overflowing with bolts of fabric in colors Marco had never imagined possible. Deep crimsons, vibrant azures, and soft, subtle jades. The noise was a constant symphony. Merchants calling out their wares, the clatter of carts on the stone-paved streets, the chatter of countless conversations in a dozen different languages. The smells were an ever-changing tapestry, the savory scent of roasting meats from food stalls, the pungent odor of fermented beans, the earthy smell of horses and leather, and the occasional welcome breath of incense from a passing temple. It was a city that served a global empire, and everywhere Marco looked, he saw evidence of its reach. Persian traders with carpets, Central Asian musicians playing strange stringed instruments, Tibetan monks in their maroon robes. Dadu was not just a capital, it was the center of the world, and Marco Polo had a front row seat to its daily magnificent operation. The Polos had arrived as emissaries, but they soon became assets. Kublai Khan, a ruler of immense curiosity, recognized their unique value. They were not just merchants. They were literate, observant, and brought with them a perspective from the far western edge of the known world. The Khan, who governed an empire of staggering diversity, valued such perspectives. He began to assign Marco in particular with special missions. The young Venetian's sharp memory for detail and his growing aptitude for languages made him an ideal envoy. He was sent on journeys to distant provinces of the empire, traveling to places few Europeans had ever seen, acting as the eyes and ears of the great Khan. These official journeys took Marco to the southwestern frontiers, to the lush, mountainous regions of Yunnan and what is now Burma. Leaving the ordered grid of Dadu behind, he traveled through landscapes of breathtaking beauty. Terraced rice paddies climbing steep hillsides like green stairways, deep river gorges shrouded in mist, and dense jungles teeming with life. In these distant lands, he observed customs that fascinated him. He wrote of people who decorated their teeth with gold, of tribes that practiced strange rituals, and of vast herds of elephants used for labor and war. His role was not to conquer or command, but to observe, to learn, and to report back. He was gathering intelligence on the resources, the customs, and the loyalty of these remote corners of the Khan's dominion. For Marco, these trips were a continuation of his education, a deep immersion into the incredible variety of human life contained within a single empire. Beyond the exotic customs, it was the day-to-day mechanics of Mongol rule that truly astonished him. He witnessed systems of organization and technology that were far in advance of anything in Europe. The use of paper money, for instance, was a revelation. Instead of carrying heavy sacks of gold and silver, commerce across the empire was conducted with lightweight, stamped pieces of paper that held the full faith and credit of the Khan. He described the dense black stone that burned like wood, coal, which was mined in the north and provided heat for the vast capital. But perhaps the most impressive was the yam, the imperial postal system. It was a network of relay stations spaced a day's ride apart, each stocked with fresh horses and provisions. A messenger carrying the Khan's orders could ride at a gallop from one station to the next, switch to a fresh horse, and continue without rest, covering distances of up to 200 miles in a single day. This system of breathtaking efficiency meant that the Khan's will could be transmitted across thousands of miles in a matter of weeks, not years. It was the nervous system of the empire, and to see it in operation was to understand the secret of Mongol power. It was not just brute force, but brilliant, pragmatic organization. For nearly 17 years, Marco served in this capacity. He was no longer a wide-eyed traveler. He was a trusted official, a familiar face in the corridors of power. He learned to speak several of the languages of the empire fluently, moving comfortably between Mongol, Persian, and even some of the Turkic dialects. He grew accustomed to the rituals of the court, the subtle hierarchies, the unspoken rules. He and his family grew wealthy, accumulating not just the silks and jewels of the East, but something more valuable, the trust and favor of the most powerful man in the world. Their lives became deeply intertwined with the fate of the Yuan dynasty. They had a home, status, and a purpose. The memory of Venice, the city of his youth, never faded, but it became a softer, more distant dream, a quiet melody playing underneath the vibrant, complex symphony of his life in the service of the Khan. Of all the wonders Marco Polo witnessed in the service of the Khan, one city remained forever etched in his memory as the finest and noblest in the world. His descriptions of it were so lavish that many in Europe later dismissed them as the fanciful exaggerations of a storyteller. This was Hangzhou, the former capital of the southern Song dynasty, a city that Kublai Khan had conquered and absorbed into his empire. The journey south from Dadu was a transition from the austere, administrative power of the north to the cultured, lyrical heart of ancient China. As they approached, the landscape became a watercolor painting of gentle hills, tranquil lakes, and winding canals. Arriving in Hangzhou was, for Marco, a profound and personal revelation. As a son of Venice, he understood cities built on water. But where Venice was a practical fortress rising from a lagoon, Hangzhou was a work of art. He described a city of immense scale, surrounded by a massive 30-mile circuit of walls, but its true soul was defined by its water. A vast, serene lake, the West Lake, lay at its heart, its surface dotted with elegant pleasure boats shaped like dragons, their painted prows gliding silently through the water. Ornamental bridges arched gracefully over the lake's inlets, each one a masterpiece of stonework. The shores were lined with pavilions, temples, and the elegant villas of the wealthy, all set amidst meticulously manicured gardens. The air was perfumed with the scent of lotus blossoms that floated on the water, and the delicate fragrance of flowering trees that lined the promenades. It was a place designed not for defense, but for contemplation and sensual pleasure. A city that seemed to breathe an air of peaceful refinement. Marco wandered through its streets, which were paved with stone and brick, a cleanliness and order that astonished him. The main thoroughfare ran the entire length of the city, a bustling artery of commerce that was lined, he claimed, with thousands of stone bridges arching over its countless canals. The markets were a spectacle of abundance that dwarfed even those of Dadu. He wrote of 10 principal marketplaces, each surrounded by multi-storied buildings where the merchants lived above their shops. The largest of these squares could host tens of thousands of people at a time. The variety of goods was staggering. Every conceivable type of vegetable and fruit, fresh fish from the lake and the sea, and meats of all kinds, including, to his surprise, the flesh of dogs, which was sold as a delicacy. But it was the culture of Hangzhou that most captivated him. He described a society of immense politeness and sophistication. The people, he noted, were peaceful and well-mannered, their lives governed by a love of beauty and harmony. They dressed in fine silks, and the city was so safe that merchants and artisans could leave their workshops open and unguarded, confident in the honesty of their neighbors. He was fascinated by the rituals of daily life, the elegant tea houses where scholars would gather to discuss poetry, the public baths that were a center of social life, the endless festivals that filled the streets with lanterns, music, and processions. At night, the city did not sleep. Watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the hours, and the restaurants and taverns remained open, serving food and wine to patrons at all hours. He noted with particular admiration the city's complex system of fire prevention, with stone towers manned by watchmen, and its efficient waste disposal, which kept the streets clean. For Marco, Hangzhou represented the pinnacle of urban civilization. It was a city that had perfected the art of living. Seeing this Venice of the East must have stirred a deep homesickness, but also a sense of awe that his own city, for all its wealth, lacked this profound ingrained sense of aesthetic and civic harmony. He spent considerable time here, either on official business for the Khan, or simply as an enthralled observer. In Hangzhou, Marco Polo found not just another exotic stop on his journey, but an ideal, a vision of peaceful and prosperous urban life that would shape his memories forever. A city of heaven indeed, whose splendors he would struggle to convey for the rest of his life. From the cultured serenity of Hangzhou, Marco's duties for the Khan led him further south, along the coast of Fujian province. The landscape changed once more, becoming more rugged and dramatic. The journey took him through terraced hillsides where tea plants grew in neat, emerald green rows, their leaves destined for the cups of scholars and officials across the empire. The air was humid and salty, a constant reminder of the proximity of the sea. He passed through cities built on steep slopes, their tiled roofs cascading down towards sheltered bays. The people here had a different character, more direct and attuned to the rhythms of the ocean, their lives intertwined with trade and fishing. His travels culminated at the great port city of Guangzhou, which Marco knew as Zaitan. If Hangzhou was the empire's cultural heart, Guangzhou was its economic lungs, the point where the riches of Cathay met the wider world. The harbour was a breathtaking forest of masts, crammed with hundreds of vessels of every size and description. The air rang with the sounds of a global workplace, the shouts of stevedores unloading spices and sandalwood, the rhythmic sawing and hammering from the immense shipyards, and the cacophony of a dozen different languages being spoken on the docks. He saw the great ocean-going junks being built, their hulls massive and sturdy, capable of weathering the fiercest storms. They were like floating fortresses with 4 or more masts and watertight bulkheads, a technology far beyond anything in European shipbuilding. Walking those bustling docks, Marco witnessed the true extent of Kublai Khan's influence. It wasn't confined to the land. Here were merchants from India, their ships laden with pearls and pepper. Arab traders, with their intricate knowledge of the monsoon winds, brought goods from the Persian Gulf and beyond. He saw the products of the known world flowing in and out of this single port, Chinese porcelain and silk heading west, while exotic goods like ivory, jewels, and rare woods flowed into the empire. It was here that the abstract concept of the Khan's power became tangible. This wasn't just a land empire. It was a maritime superpower, controlling the most lucrative trade routes on Earth. For a Venetian, a people whose identity was built on seafaring commerce, this was the most profound lesson of all. He was standing at the center of a web of commerce that made the Mediterranean seem like a provincial pond, a realization that would forever alter his understanding of the world and his place within it. The seasons turned, one flowing into the next with a gentle rhythm. The initial shock of arrival softened into the quiet comfort of routine. What began as a grand adventure gradually became simply life. Marco was no longer the wide-eyed young Venetian. He was a man in his 30s, his identity now woven with the threads of the East. The years in the Khan's service were not a single event, but a slow, steady accumulation of days, of small moments that transformed him. He had arrived as an emissary. He now lived as a fixture, a familiar face in the vast machinery of the empire. The strangeness of the food, the music, the customs, it all faded into a new normal. The sense of incense and stir-fried vegetables became the scent of home. The sound of the Chinese language, once an impenetrable melody, now held meaning, its tones and cadences as familiar to his ear as the Venetian dialect of his youth. This deep immersion was a quiet education. He learned to move through the complex social hierarchies of the court with an instinctive understanding, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. He mastered not just one, but several of the languages spoken across the Khan's diverse domains, his tongue effortlessly switching between the guttural commands of Mongol, the flowing poetry of Persian, and the sing-song nuances of the local Chinese dialects. This linguistic ability was his greatest tool, allowing him to hear stories directly from merchants, soldiers, and farmers, to understand the empire not just from its throne room, but from its streets and fields. The Polos, through their loyalty and usefulness, amassed a significant fortune, their wealth a quiet testament to their standing. They were no longer just visitors. They were participants, their lives deeply entangled with the fate of the Yuan dynasty. Yet, beneath this surface of assimilation, a quiet undercurrent remained. The memory of Venice was a persistent, soft-focused dream. He would sometimes catch a scent on the air, the smell of the sea on a particular breeze, or the aroma of a certain herb, that would transport him instantly to the canals of his youth. He would remember the sound of water lapping against stone foundations, the cries of the gondoliers, the particular light of the Adriatic sunset. It was a nostalgia, not of pain, but of a gentle, persistent wandering. The life he had built here was rich and full of purpose, but it was built on a foundation of otherness. He was always, in some fundamental way, the man from the West, a fact that both set him apart and defined his unique value to the Khan. He lived in a state of dual belonging, a man with two homes, each holding a piece of his heart, separated by a continent of experience. The boy who had left Venice was gone, replaced by a man who carried its memory like a treasured, faded map, while living a life its streets could never have imagined. The fleet that departed from Guangzhou was a small city setting out to sea. 14 large junks, their battened sails emblazoned with the symbols of the Yuan dynasty, formed an imposing convoy. The air on the docks was thick with a mixture of scents. The salty tang of the ocean, the pungent smell of tar being applied to hulls, and the faint, floral perfume emanating from the enclosed cabin of the princess. The Polo stood on the deck of the lead ship, watching the skyline of the city they had known for so long slowly recede into the morning haze. The sounds of the port, the shouts, the creaking of cranes, the distant temple bells faded, replaced by the rhythmic slap of waves against the wooden hull and the sigh of the wind in the rigging. They were finally leaving Cathay, not by the long, arduous land route they had come, but by the great, unknown expanse of the Indian Ocean. It was a path fraught with different perils. The voyage south was a lesson in the sheer scale of the maritime world. They sailed along the coast of Champa, where the air grew heavy and warm, smelling of exotic blossoms and damp earth. They passed the coast of Java, its volcanic peaks appearing as dark shapes on the horizon. But the true test began when they ventured into the open ocean, leaving the sight of land behind for weeks at a time. The sea was a vast, empty plain of shifting blues and greens, its surface broken only by the occasional leaping fish or a distant waterspout. The sun was a merciless orb by day, reflecting off the water with a blinding intensity. At night, They navigated by stars that were strange and unfamiliar, constellations that did not appear in the Venetian sky. The journey was not a peaceful cruise. The ocean revealed its power with terrifying suddenness. Towering storms would blow in without warning, turning the sea into a churning chaos of black water and white foam. The massive junks, so sturdy in the harbor, became tiny toys tossed on immense waves. Sailors scrambled across the slippery decks, fighting to reef the sails as the wind howled through the rigging like a demon. Below deck, in the cramped and airless quarters, the passengers would cling to whatever was fixed, listening to the groaning of the ship's timbers, praying they would hold. Sickness was a constant companion, the relentless rolling of the ship leaving even seasoned travelers weak and nauseated. The human cost of the journey began to mount. A sickness, perhaps scurvy, or some other malady born of long confinement and poor diet, swept through the fleet. Marco would have witnessed the grim, quiet rituals of burial at sea, the weighted bodies slipping beneath the waves into the dark, deep water. Of the 600 passengers and crew who had set out from Kwangju, only 18 would survive the entire journey to Hormuz. The princess, protected in her sheltered cabin, was a constant reminder of their sacred duty, a fragile treasure they were sworn to protect against the indifference of the ocean. For months, their world was reduced to the wooden deck of the ship, the endless horizon, and the struggle for survival. The splendors of Hangzhou and the power of Dadu felt like a lifetime away, a dream from another world. They were alone on a timeless, watery road, their only goal to reach the western shore. After more than 2 years at sea, the sight of the Persian coast was not just a landmark, it was a miracle. The dry, brown hills rising from the water were the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. They had delivered the princess, but they had paid a terrible price. The sea voyage from Persia felt like a journey back through time. The familiar sight of Constantinople's imposing sea walls and the great dome of the Hagia Sophia rising from the water was a profound relief. This city, the great bridge between Europe and Asia, was a landmark they understood. The air smelled different here, less of spice and incense, more of the sea and the familiar sense of Christendom. They did not linger long, their eyes fixed firmly on the final stretch. Taking ship again, they entered the choppy waters of the Black Sea, a body of water that felt like a back door to their own world. The coastline was rugged and green, dotted with Genoese and Venetian trading posts. And then, at the port of Negroponte, it happened. After nearly a quarter century, they heard it again, spoken casually by merchants on the docks. The Venetian dialect. The sound was like a key turning in a long locked door. It was the language of their childhood, of their memories, a sound so ordinary and yet so startling that it must have brought them to a standstill. The journey was almost over. When they finally stepped onto the familiar stones of Venice, they were ghosts returned. The city was exactly as they had left it. The same canals reflecting the same palaces, the same voices echoing in the same narrow alleyways. But they were utterly unrecognizable. Their faces were weathered by desert sun and sea salt, their postures shaped by years in the saddle. Their clothing, though of fine Eastern fabric, was worn and styled in a foreign cut. They spoke Italian with a strange, archaic accent, their speech peppered with unfamiliar Mongol and Persian words. They were strangers in their own home. The famous story of their return speaks to this profound dislocation. Invited to a family gathering, they were met with politeness but little recognition. It was only when they slit open the seams of their travel-worn garments, spilling a fortune in rubies, emeralds, and pearls onto the table, that their astonished relatives truly saw them. The jewels were the undeniable proof of an impossible journey, a silent testament to the 24 years that had transformed the three travelers. The wealth was real, but the greater challenge was the quiet one. Learning to live in a city that had stood still while they had traversed the world. Venice was unchanged, but they were not, and the quiet task of stitching their old lives to their new selves had only just begun. The quiet life of a wealthy Venetian merchant was not to be Marco's fate for long. The rivalries that defined the Mediterranean world soon reached out and pulled him back into the current of history. In 1298, just a few years after his return, a naval war erupted between Venice and his great commercial rival, Genoa. Marco, now a respected citizen, financed and commanded a galley in the Venetian fleet. At the Battle of Cazzola, the Venetians suffered a devastating defeat, and Marco Polo was captured and taken as a prisoner of war. His journey, which had taken him from the pinnacle of power in the court of Kublai Khan to the quiet comforts of home, had now led him to a Genoese prison cell. It must have seemed a cruel and ironic twist of fate to have survived the perils of the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean, only to be confined within cold stone walls just a short sail from Venice. Yet, within that confinement, a remarkable partnership was forged. Marco shared his prison with a man named Rustichello da Pisa, a writer of popular romances. To pass the long, idle hours, Marco began to recount his experiences in the East. He spoke of the cities of white marble, of the burning black stone, of the paper money, of the immense scale of everything he had seen. Rustichello, a professional storyteller, recognized that these were not just the ramblings of a well-traveled merchant. This was the stuff of legend. He began to diligently record Marco's words, shaping the raw narrative into a compelling book. The collaboration was a perfect match. Marco's incredible memory for detail provided the substance, while Rustichello's skill as a writer provided the structure and flair. The prison cell, a place of limitation, became the birthplace of a work that would expand the horizons of Europe. The book they produced, known as The Travels of Marco Polo or Il Milione, the million, perhaps a reference to the immense wealth he described, was a chronicle of wonders. Dictated over many months, it was a slow, deliberate act of recollection, a journey taken once more in the mind. Marco revisited the scent of sandalwood in Xanadu, the feel of silk in the markets of Dadu, the sight of the great junks in the harbor of Quanzhou. He brought to life the people he had met, the Turkoman nomads, the Buddhist monks, the officials of the Khan's court. Rustichello, with his ear for a good story, ensured the narrative was engaging, often framing it within the chivalric traditions familiar to a European audience. The act of dictation was more than just remembering. It was an act of preservation, of translating a lived sensory experience into words on a page. By the time Marco Polo was released from captivity in 1299, as part of a prisoner exchange, he carried with him not just his freedom, but the manuscript that would become his legacy. The story was now complete, ready to be shared with a world that was about to be profoundly shaken by its revelations. Marco Polo lived out his remaining years in Venice, a quiet patriarch surrounded by his family and his fortune, a keeper of silent, vast memories. His book, initially met with skepticism as a book of marvels, slowly seeped into the European consciousness, planting seeds of curiosity that would one day bear fruit in the age of exploration. His journey was more than a personal adventure. It was a thread connecting East and West, a story that reminds us of the vast, beautiful tapestry of human experience woven along the Silk Road. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander those same distant horizons and dream of the gentle sounds of a world waiting to be discovered.